Hello, everyone. Welcome to Election Watch. We are less than 230 days from this next election day. There are many issues to consider in an election, and while the issues may not affect the race to the White House, who ends up in the White House will likely affect the issues.
And today, we're pleased to be joined by someone who keeps an eye on those issues, Roz Brooks, PwC's public policy leader. Roz, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So before we get into some of the issues we were planning on talking about, I want to cover a breaking news topics. Ohio Republicans had their Senate primary. Bernie Moreno emerged victorious, actually, to my mind, surprisingly victorious in terms of the margin of victory. What are your thoughts on what Ohio Republicans have done in terms of their nominee and with setting up a pretty important race in terms of control of the Senate with the incumbent Senator Sherrod Brown?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because they've kind of talked about it in terms of the MAGA candidate versus the establishment candidate. And you read a lot of the, Monday night kind of post-analysis and talk about the era of DeWine is kind of over, kind of from an Ohio standpoint. But it'll be interesting to see because Democrats believe they have the candidate that they want. Janice and I were talking earlier, we're not sure they expected him to win by such a large margin, but from their perspective, Schumer's PAC had engaged in kind of bolstering the conservative bona fides of Moreno. And so from a standpoint of who they wanted Sherrod Brown to face, they think that they have the right person. From my perspective, it'll be interesting to see how they position themselves because Sherrod Brown has always run in Ohio as a very populist, nationalist, kind of protectionist kind of person from the trade and manufacturing standpoint. So how the two will come together and how it will shake out will be of interest. I'm curious, though, from your perspective, Rohit, when you look at kind of what happened on the Republican side, what you think about it.
The folks I was talking to before the primaries, a couple of weeks ago now, were sort of the mind like, whoever wins the Ohio Senate Republican primary is going to be a credible candidate. So unlike, say, Montana or some other states where the National Republican Senatorial Committee got engaged, kind of tried to push a candidate out, tried to promote a different candidate, they didn't do that in Ohio. They thought Moreno or LaRose or Matt Dolan, the three candidates who are running, any one of them would be a credible candidate against Senator Brown in a presidential year with Trump likely to carry Ohio 8 to 10, 12 points, something in that range. So they spent really no money. Interestingly, Schumer's super PAC spent money, right, to promote Bernie Moreno. I always love when the Democrats engage in the Republican primary. They're like, Bernie Moreno, too conservative for Ohio. And Republican primary voters are like, oh, well, right. I'm interested in that. Thank you. You're talking my language now. But it's risky, right? This is a little bit playing with fire. Like you promote the candidate you think you have the best chance of beating. But if you don't beat him, you have helped install a Republican senator whose policy views are much further away from your own than if Matt Dolan or Frank LaRose had won. At least that's the perception. No one knows how they're going to vote really, but that's the perception kind of going in. So there's a little bit of playing with fire here, right? Much like in 2016, the Clinton campaign was like, please, please, please let Donald Trump be the nominee. And then lo and behold,
true enough.
He became the president. So you careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
Let me turn a little bit to the current administration and some of your other many areas of expertise. It's had a very active regulatory agenda during this administration, especially in the finance sector. What do they keep doing and how does either election outcome affect that regulatory nature for the finance sector and especially focus on the SEC and the CFPB?
So I think we can all agree that the reason you've seen that kind of focus in the regulatory area and that we've seen, I would say over the last decade, if not more, is because of the inability to really get a lot done at the federal level from the congressional standpoint, except for things that absolutely have to get done. That being the case, I think it was with the 2016 election, our financial reg group, because I can't take credit for this, talked about how the issue is not the regulation that's put out under a particular administration. It's personnel becomes the policy. So it's about who are in the regulatory seats in terms of what you're going to see. And I think no one knows specifically what a Trump administration is going to look like, in my estimation. But ideologically speaking, as you think about like less regulation, less government in terms of, I know you mentioned CFPB and SEC. There is also a proposal that was in former President Trump's budget when he was president, as well as is supported by House members, that would take another regulatory agency, the PCAOB, who we're all familiar with from an audit perspective, and fold them into the SEC. So there's a focus on downsizing from a regulatory standpoint, and that's true in the financial space too. So all of the controversy that existed around the CFPB, like I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see either lack of funding or kind of attention to kind of enforcement. That's typically where you tend to see the differences, right? Around enforcement, how much do you roll back some of the rules that have been done? I think about from the SEC, the climate rule. Everyone's focused on the climate rule. The SEC, it's in the legal jurisdiction, right? And it's in the courts. SEC's defending. Does an SEC under President Trump defend the climate rule kind of within the courts? And what does that look like kind of on the other side?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, right? You may inherit a rule that you don't like, and you don't, instead of just pulling it back, you let the legal challenges go, and you say, yeah, it turns out they're right. We think this is unconstitutional or beyond the authority in the statute or whatever it is. There are multiple ways to kind of attack it if there's a change.
And once in a while, they just don't fill seats. And so the agency can't do anything. That works too.
And depending on what shakes out from a congressional standpoint, right? Do you have the power of the purse kind of restricting what they're able to do, what they're able to focus on, kind of when you think about approps and things like that,
well,
riders
also,
that are put
if you have a Senate that's controlled by a different party than the president, then the processing of nominations, who gets confirmed, who gets a vote, right? All of that starts to come into play. Okay, I want to take us a little bit outside our own borders. Let's look around the rest of the world. Every day, the world gets more chaotic than it was the day before. There's a lot happening in the foreign policy space, in the trade space. Talk a little bit about, from your perspective, the differences between the two candidates and how it affects what happens outside our borders.
I would say when President Biden came in, one of the things that I spent a lot of time talking with companies about is the fact that this may not be as different as you thought it would be when you're thinking about trade and sanctions and competition with China in particular. Turns out, like, it wasn't as different as they kind of thought it would be. And so I do think there are areas of similarity between them when you think about where we are currently from a U.S. protectionist standpoint around trade and competition, particularly with China. I think where it's a clear differentiation and they differ is their view around multilateral organizations, right? And the role of the U.S. kind of around the world. And so where Biden has been, the U.S. needs to lead. We need to work with our allies. We need to form, institutions like NATO are very important, the UN. President Trump has questioned, like, not just when he was president, but also in the campaign, about the role of NATO or whether or not maybe we should be charging or lending money or requiring them to do certain things to get protection that kind of is required. And I think how that is viewed by other countries in terms of, if you're thinking about being in the EU, and you're looking at the US and you're determining whether or not they're going to be there as an ally for you, kind of on whatever, you are closer to Russia, closer to China. You're having to figure out, if you're Germany, okay, what am I going to do from whether it's my oil standpoint, like supply, whatever it is, like, I may have to go it alone. I may have to decide my own thing. And so the implications, I think, for US domestic kind of policy, more so than I can imagine, are dependent on kind of how we're not only viewed around the world, but the stances that we're taking. The other thing I would just say that I was noticing, in part, there are a lot of elections going on around the world this year, like in terms of, and a lot of candidates are in the mold of Donald Trump in terms of very nationalistic and protectionist and populist. And so depending on who wins these elections around the country will have a tremendous impact on kind of how a Biden or a Trump administration is viewed and what they're able to achieve kind of globally.
One thing with Congress itself, there are a number of retirements in the Congress, kind of a surprising number of some more junior members. There are toss-up elections, relatively narrow group, but they're there. How does all of that, do you think, potentially change the next Congress?
it's something we think about a lot. And I'm sure it's something you all think about a lot as we figure out how the chess pieces are going to move, who's going to be in what seats, how is this going to affect our ability to engage or who we choose to engage with. I think stepping back, right, if we start macro in terms of who's going to control the chambers, like it'll be interesting to see. I think people are presuming you'll get a flip of the Senate, and will you get a flip of the House? We'll see, right? But when you think about the Senate, you've got Montana, you've got Ohio that we talked about earlier, and you have Arizona with Sinema having kind of retired and kind of an open race in Arizona. Those are kind of the toss-ups. And West Virginia, Joe Manchin retired, to your point about retirements, and that pretty much has been ceded to Republicans.
You treat it as 50-50 going in.
Yeah, right? And so Democrats have to defend those three tough, Arizona, Montana, Ohio. And as we just talked about, like, do we know what's going to happen? Did you get the candidate you really wanted when you think about Ohio? It's a tough year for Democrats on the Senate side, kind of from an uphill. So we think about that. We think about, and that, as we talked about in terms of influencing whatever administration you have, a Senate who has the power to advise and consent as it relates to nominations. What will that bring? What will that mean? And then when you think about a lot of the retirements, just generally, as you're thinking about the House, it seems that you have a lot of the old guard retiring in terms of, and so what does that mean for kind of the ideological bent of a new Republican conference, no matter House Republican conference, even Senate Republican conference, if you look at kind of those that have recently been elected to the Senate. And for business, what does that mean? You know, people, they flippantly say in the last, it's not your dad's Republican Party, right? This is on both sides, that populism, that nationalistic, kind of you're not just going to side with business because it's business. It's a lot of issues that may not normally have been a problem. You may have to think about differently in terms of how you engage. And so we pay attention to those retirements in terms of saying, okay, there's another friend, if you will, that we've lost in terms of who understood, knew. So now you've got to think about re-educating, engaging, looking at those races, who's likely to come in? Is it from the Republican side? Is it kind of more conservative-leaning people that are coming in instead of those that are more moderate? And it seems to be.
All right, Roz, we could do this for another couple hours, I'm sure, but we do have to cut it off at this point. Thank you for joining us today. It's been great. And thank you for tuning in. Stay with Policy on Demand because we're staying close to the issues, tax, the election, and beyond. Take care.